Each year, the East Canadian high Arctic population of light-bellied Brent geese make an incredible journey, travelling from Ireland through Iceland and then up to the Canadian breeding grounds. This migration is something around 10,000 kilometres annually, and it's one of the longest migrations that any goose species makes. And in fact, we found nests within 500 miles of the North Pole. And this is really remarkable for a bird that's not much bigger than the average farmyard duck. My name is Stuart Bearhop and I'm a researcher at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus. And along with the Irish Brent Goose Research Group and colleagues in Iceland, we've been better trying to understand their incredible migration, following them from the urban landscapes of Dublin right through to the desolate wildernesses of Ellesmere Island where they breed. And this is the story of our wild goose chase. The annual cycle of these geese is run to a very tight schedule. The summer season up in the Arctic where they breed is so short that they really only have just enough time to incubate eggs and rear chicks to fledging. If they arrive too early, there'll be too much snow on the ground, nowhere to nest, nothing to eat. If they arrive too late, then they won't have enough time to rear those chicks, and the chicks will not have fledged by the time the first snows of winter arrive. And so the clock starts ticking actually way back in late winter in Ireland. One of the main wintering areas in Ireland is around Dublin, and the geese are a familiar sight in many of the city's parks and sports grounds. And we know from much of the work they've done that the best thing for preparing for migration is the marine eelgrass, zostra. But there's so many birds wintering around the Dublin areas that this gradually becomes grazed down, and once that happens the birds start moving into the parks for food. And in these areas there are very few natural predators and the birds become very habituated. You can walk within just a few metres of them. But this doesn't mean they're not suffering from stressors.
So my part in the research of the Brent Goose team is funded by the Icelandic government. So I'm here on an Icelandic fellowship, and my particular research question within the team have to do with the stress and disturbance of the geese, both in the urban areas in Ireland as well as in Iceland, and to some extent what happens in the breeding ground. And we analyse the stress through the means of stress hormones as well as behavioural analyses. And we can measure that in different tissues of the animals where they excrete the stress hormones into different parts of their body. The samples that we have here we collect in two ways. Firstly, we can collect them directly in the field, so we can find the individuals and we can collect fecal samples from the individuals in the field. We can take a lot of samples when we capture them, and we do that with so-called cannon nets. And these are nets that we shoot over with the geese with explosive cannons. Then we handle them and we try to process them as quick as we can. And so the samples that we take from the geese there are, for example, fecal samples. We also take feathers from them, and then we draw some blood, and from the blood samples we can actually isolate their DNA, which we can then relate to see who's related to whom within the cats, as well as we can identify the sex. The questions that we are asking with this material and with the hormone analyses is how animals perceive risk and how they modulate the risk.
So this perception of risk may move them into foraging areas where the resources are of lower quality, and that in turn would have implications for the timing of migration. By early spring, the geese are really gearing up for the next challenge, and that is the 1,000 kilometre flight between Ireland and Iceland across the North Atlantic Ocean, which is fairly inhospitable if you're a goose. And those birds that have eaten the most marine resources will have put on the most mass, and they will get a head start on their competitors. And we know the birds that leave fattest from Iceland are the ones that are most likely to come back with offspring.
So I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the project, and I'm interested in how the individual geese solve the problems they face on their migration. They fly from Iceland over the Greenland ice cap, it's over 1,000 metres high, and then all the way up into the high Arctic Canadian islands. And we assume, we went up there in 2014, we were very lucky, and when we got there, they were already on eggs amidst the snow on the only bits of ground where there was no snow lying, and there was almost nothing to eat. So we assume that they bring almost everything they need to power their migration, and in fact to lay those eggs if they're a female. They have to bring it all with them from Iceland. So they just have to stock up, they put on almost 50% of their body weight in some cases, and then they fly. But of course burning fat is a real problem in that it produces a load of free radicals which are damaging to the DNA in the cells of the birds, and so they need to have a way of preventing this happening and preventing that damage. And so what they use is a range of chemicals called antioxidants, which are the kind of things, if you think about when we eat so-called superfoods, they contain a lot of antioxidants too. And so that's the kind of thing that the geese need to stock up on. And they need to take it with them to prevent damage to their own cells. But the females also need to take more antioxidants with them, because those are the only antioxidants they can give to their chicks. And so anything they want to put into the eggs, not only do they have to bring the resources to make the eggs, they have to bring the resources to actually supply their chicks with antioxidants. So the goslings hatch out at maybe 20 or 30 grams, and they've got to get to over 1 kilo in order to make the flight back. And so it's been timed so that they'll hopefully hatch as the grass is growing, and those peak little shoots at the top are full of the nitrogen they need in order to build that muscle, build those feathers, because they've got to grow all their feathers and massively increase their size in such a tiny period of time. Maybe 6 weeks they've got to do that before the snow comes again, and if they haven't got big enough to fly by the time the snow comes, I'm afraid that's curtains for them.
So while it looks harsh for the chicks, they are adapted to this kind of environment. On the other hand, human beings aren't, and we face a number of challenges ourselves when we're working up there. So obviously the cold is a problem, but actually it gets mild quite quickly up there, so it's really only the first few weeks of the breeding season where we're really wrapping up warm. Sometimes it gets up to about 11 degrees, so very balmy. Getting around's another problem. In the early spring, the snow melt really makes the tundra a very wet and muddy place, and the quads are frequently getting stuck. But again, as the breeding season progresses, it becomes easier to get around on the quads. However, most of the geese actually nest in places far away from the reach of a quad, across frozen sea or certainly pack ice on remote gravelly islands. And in those instances, we have to resort to helicopter. The other thing that's magnificent about there is, of course, the landscape and the wildlife. There's not a lot of wildlife around, but what is there is truly spectacular. And so we get to see some really incredibly rare animals, in fact some very incredibly rare plants as well. But of course that also means we do get the occasional unwanted guest around the camp. So over the years we've probably marked something like 4,500 geese, and we've now got a database with 160,000 re-sightings in it. And this has allowed us to build up a really detailed picture of their population biology and also the timing of their annual cycle.
Okay, so we know that the climate is changing at the moment, and we know this has important effects on a lot of animal populations. In particular, we're interested in things that affect the demography of animals, so things that drive changes in reproduction or survival, because these determine population dynamics, both in the short term but also for the long-term stability of populations. In addition, the climate also tends to affect the phenology of events, so this is basically the timing of events. So when, for example, migratory species leave to go to their breeding grounds, or even the timing of bud burst or something in oak trees, for example. Now, the geese are a particularly interesting species to study in this context because they are migratory species. They basically they encounter a lot of different sort of climatic regions as they travel on their long journey. And also these regions tend to be experiencing climate change at differing rates. So for example, climate change is probably fastest at the poles where these things breed. In addition, because they're a migratory species, you also get these very interesting sort of carryover effects where processes that happen maybe in the wintering grounds subsequently affect what's going on in the breeding grounds. And so we've been very interested in the effect that the weather and the climatic conditions have upon the survival and reproduction of the Brent geese. And interestingly, we think a critical period in their life cycle, or their annual cycle rather, is when they go to breed in June. So the weather in that very short window, perhaps in the first 2 weeks of June, when they've just arrived at the breeding grounds ready to breed, has really important implications for, firstly, how productive they're going to be in terms of how many chicks they're going to be able to bring back in the winter, but also things like female survival as well. So we think there's a trade-off. So basically in good years, when it's right for breeding, you can breed, but females take a bit of a hit to their survival because of the amount they invest in terms of like incubation and producing eggs and so on. So the best years are really those where the snow melts nice and early, so you can breed early, and then you give the chicks as much time as possible in the Arctic to try and get as much strength, as much size before they have to make that long journey back.
So of course these geese do breed in an incredibly desolate place, but as we have seen, the arm of humanity does touch them there with these increasing stormy springs going to present more problems to the birds. Perhaps it is the indirect effects of climate change that are the greatest threat to these geese and the animals that they live with. As the climate ameliorates, the sea ice is not going to form as completely during the winter months, and that means during the summer, passages open up between these massive islands in the Queen Elizabeths. And as a consequence of that, it means ships can gain access to these islands during the summer months, and that means the mineral resources that they contain are now exploitable. And there are a number of areas, that, including the Fossheim Peninsula, where these geese breed, and many of the wolves are, where there are coal deposits and coal seams that have already been looked at by mining companies. However, as we saw from the very start, these geese have managed to embrace humanity and live in very close proximity with humans in the Dublin area. And maybe that adaptive capability will allow them to persist. But it's something we simply don't know at this point, and it's something that we'll continue to investigate over the coming years.